Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Legionaries of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the StarQuest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 232, recovering Dignitatis Humanae 4-5 on communal and family religious liberty. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican and frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. Yesterday, we spoke about how each must seek natural law as a participation in the eternal law in their conscience, and they should be free to do so. Today, we're going to talk about religious liberty of families and larger religious organizations and groups who all should be free to teach and meet as they see fit, including the education of the children of religious people. So 4 is on the freedom of religion applied to religious organizations, not just individuals. So it has various topics within the sub-paragraphs. And there's 5 of them, which A to C will cover together, which is on religious communities will be given freedom in their own worship and internal working. Then we'll cover D to E, which is on religious organizations can spread the doctrine without coercion and hold meetings related to religion or charity. So let's read the first part, 4A through C. A, the freedom or immunity from coercion in matters religious, which is the endowment of persons and individuals, is also to be recognized as the right when they act in community. Religious communities are to be a requirement of the social nature both of man and of religion itself. B, provided the just demands of public order are observed, religious communities rightfully claim freedom in order that they may govern themselves according to their own norms, honor the supreme being in public worship, assist their members in the practice of religious life, strengthen by instruction, and promote institutions in which they may join together for the purpose of ordering their own lives in accordance with their religious principles. C, religious communities also have the right not to be hindered either by legal measures or by administrative action on the part of government in selecting, training, appointing, and transfer of their own ministers, in communicating with religious authorities and communities abroad, in erecting buildings for religious purposes, and in the acquisition and use of suitable funds or properties. Before we get into these subparagraphs, I think it's important to notice 2 things that were common back in the day that are not as common today to note this. First of all, at this point, communism took over all of Eastern Europe, Russia, etc. Communism fell in everywhere but China, North Korea, and Cuba, basically, I guess Vietnam too. And although some of those, like China and Vietnam, are really not communist in the strict sense anymore, if you're talking about philosophy, they're still totalitarian. And Russia, under Putin, is definitely towards that direction. And totalitarian dictators want control. They want to control religion because how are you going to control the people fully if you're going to be totalitarian and controlling everything instead of just seeking the common good and the things you can as a government, unless you control religion? You want to control religion. At times, this can be an issue in Western countries where states want to control religion, whether it's in education, which we'll get to with families, the next one, or whether it's in charity or things like that, and such. A second thing, which is important to note, is that historically, there was much more cooperation with the secular authority in determining the bishops, especially in majority Catholic countries, where the king or prince or whatever would often have some kind of veto or some kind of role in selecting them. The church in the 20th century and 21st century has generally eschewed such arrangements, and now very few bishops have that requirement. There are a few places that still somehow the government presents lists to the Vatican or the government can veto them or things like that. There are a few where it's based on election in different dioceses in Europe, and then also the concordat with China has some aspect where the Chinese government has some control over bishops. But the ideal here is to go away from that, to say, hey, we want to be able to select our own religious authorities, our own bishops, without government interference. So now we get to the actual number. So A is talking about, hey, we have freedom, for the community, not just the individual. And then we get to all the details. What kind of freedom do they have? They have the freedom to govern, right? So the Catholic Church can't be forced to do things for the government. For example, I talked to a priest who was actually the lead person on a lawsuit back in the 90s when, under the Clinton administration, Clinton wanted a certain announcement to be read at every Mass for service members. And this priest, he was in the reserves, and he had Mass that weekend. He said, no, I won't read it. And so it ended up being a case that basically it said, no, the government can't force as part of the service, as far as the religious service, to read that. If the government wants to have this read to service members outside of the religious service, that's fine. But that idea of how we govern, how we worship there too, how we help members of religion, teaching really, which we'll get to even more in D. And then we promote religious organizations. You look at what I'm doing, through a lot of what I'm doing, I'm promoting different Catholic groups, Catholic organizations. And then training ministers. How do we select? Do we train? Do we transfer priests or Protestant pastors or imams or things like that? That should be free. And then communicate with co-religious abroad and building religious buildings. A lot of things which a totalitarian government doesn't want to do. And it's saying, no, we have the right to do these as a religion. And other religions also have the right to do this. So the Protestants have the right to build their church, and the Muslims have the right to build their mosque, and the Hindus have the right to build their temple, and the Jews have the right to build their synagogue and have their own ministers and promote it, and all those different things. So D&E is about religious organizations can spread doctrine without coercion, D, and hold meetings related to religion, E. So let's read it. D. Religious communities also have the right not to be hindered in their public teaching and witness to the faith, whether by spoken word or by the written word. However, in spreading faith and in introducing religious practices, everyone ought to, at all times, to refrain from any manner of action which might seem to carry a hint of coercion, or a kind of persuasion that would be dishonorable or unworthy, especially when dealing with the poor and uneducated people. Such a manner of action would have to be considered an abuse of one's right and a violation of the rights of others. E. In addition, it comes within the meaning of religious freedom. The religious communities should not be prohibited from freely undertaking to show the special value of their doctrine in what concerns the organization of society and the inspiration of the whole human activity. Finally, the social nature of man and the very nature of religion afford the foundation of the right of men to freely hold meetings and to establish educational, cultural, charitable, and social organizations under the impulse of their own religious sense. First of all, we have the freedom to write and preach about religion. It's interesting that in the U.S., at least, we have the First Amendment to the Constitution, which deals both freedom of religion and freedom of speech and freedom of the press, which are really all interconnected in this number D, right? We have freedom of religion to preach out loud, freedom of speech, and to write, freedom of the press. And this obviously is good, and we have all this freedom, and that's great. That we have freedom, and religion should have freedom to promote their things. Obviously, there would be limits on this. If one religion wants to say, hey, we should kill everybody of this other religion, that would be something that the government could have some kind of control over, right? If we're not saying kill people and other things, obviously the government shouldn't have control whether the Catholics say, hey, abortion is wrong, whether some kind of Protestant church says abortion is great. Both those are allowed. Now, when we get to this, we obviously can't do it in coercive or dishonest ways. And coercive is fairly obvious where it's pressure and force. Dishonest gets a little more complicated because sometimes it's like we're giving free food, free clothes. At what point does that become dishonest where the people are just coming for the food or clothes? And at what point is that fair? Because obviously if we're having, hey, a come and see night about the Catholic Church, we're going to have food and some kind of something to drink and things. And that's not being dishonest. We're just being charitable in that sense. And the exact line can sometimes be unclear. But it's important to note this dishonesty because one of the things that I think Francis was unjustly criticized for, because it doesn't work well in English, but it does work well in Spanish and things like that, is he would speak against proselytism, which is this kind of dishonest kind of bringing people into your religion where you go out and say, hey, if you come to church, I'll give you these, fancy jeans that we really need, and you're poor and uneducated, you don't know much, and you need jeans for work and things like that, and I'll give them for free if you come to my church. And so the people aren't coming because it's true or anything, they're just coming for the free jeans. And those type of things can easily get dishonest. And Pope Francis was very much for evangelization, but in Spanish and Italian, evangelization and proselytism are not as synonymous as they are in English. Proselytism refers to this kind of dishonest pushing of the faith. And I will try and remember to put an article in the show notes. I'm recording this more than a month beforehand, so my memory might not be perfect and remember to do it. when I do this, but if you search my name and the word Patheos, P-A-T-H-E-O-S, with evangelization and Pope Francis or something, it will come up because I wrote about it back then. So religions can form groups and charities. There is this problem in a lot of societies where you try and make all charity under the government. Now, religions can take money from the government to help with charity, things that the government wants done. If the government says, hey, we want to feed the homeless, and, well, we already have a soup kitchen there, why don't we, we'll give you $500,000 to expand it so you can serve a whole lot more homeless people. And that can be done because government should promote religion in that sense. But if the government has absolute control over all of the charity, that's a big problem. And they can meet where they want. And it's good because a religion inspires good things in others. And this isn't just Christianity or just Catholicism. For example, when I was growing up, I was surrounded by a number of Sikhs. They're a religion from the Punjab area of India, and it's India on the border of Pakistan, one of the states or provinces there of India. And they have a practice of always having a free meal after the service, and anybody can come and anybody can get a free meal. And at some of their temples, they'll have it every single day. And part of this is their charity, but also their equality, that we all eat together, we're all equal, is part of their understanding of human relationships. So moving on to paragraph 5, which is about the family's right to religious practice, including parents choosing their kids' education, which is the biggest challenge in family right to religious freedom. So let's read it. The family, since it is deciding its own original right, has the right freely to live its own domestic religious life under the guidance of parents. Parents, moreover, have the right to determine, in accordance with their own religious beliefs, the kind of religious education their children are to receive. Government, in consequence, must acknowledge the right of parents to make a genuinely free choice of schools and other means of education. And the use of this freedom of choice is not to be made for a reason for imposing unjust burdens on parents, whether directly or indirectly. Besides, the right of parents are violated if their children are forced to attend lessons or instructions or are not in agreement with their religious beliefs, or if a single system of education, which all religious formation is excluded, is imposed upon all. So this family has the right to live their religion as they see fit, and they have the right to determine their school based on religion. Now, the government must acknowledge this and give freedom of choice, and not have a monolithic government ed where you have to attend a bunch of classes where they're saying how contraception is great and all these other things. And even in the U.S., a lot of times, certain kinds of more questionable things where Catholics would disagree with, even in the public schools, there's a way to have a waiver and your kids don't have to attend it. Because we don't want to force kids to go to anti-religious or non-religious content that's contrary to religion. Now, obviously, this is not to say government can set no standards at all for parents and kids learning. There's nothing wrong with the government setting standards for by grade 3, they should have this level in math and English or whatever the native language is in the country, or things like that, because that is making sure that the kids get the education they need in general. The government has a right and duty to work towards that, but they don't have a right to interfere with the religious education, or if the parents want to homeschool, although they would have the right to say, hey, your kids have to do a test every 3 years to make sure that their English and math is okay or something along those lines, to make sure that there's a certain degree of standards for the subjects, the key subjects, the secular or subjects like English and math. I'm just using that. Anyway, so that concludes today. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. I do this podcast on a volunteer basis, and my local religious community relies on donations to help pay our bills. If you want to support my community, you can go to patreon.com/frmatthewlc. There's also a link for a one-time donation and the Patreon at my own website, frmatthewlc.com. You can also donate to help StarQuest at sqpn.com/give. Tomorrow, we're going to continue with the next paragraphs of Dignitatis Humanae, which is paragraph 6, on the government should allow and foster religion. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which can provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information, like playlists and a reading plan, go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X.
Amen.